Sorry, I have a flickering screen. Okay. In his classic The Dark Abyss of Time, Paolo Rossi summed up historiographical common sense when he argued that the Enlightenment discovery of the death of geological time was a change as radical in the position of man as the far more celebrated Copernican revolution. Man in Robert Hooke's time, Rossi wrote, had a past of 6,000 years, and those of Kant's time were conscious instead of a past of millions of years. For more than 2 centuries, the discovery of deep time, which replaced the young earth of the Bible and shook the confidence in its historical accuracy, has been regarded as a crucial breakthrough in the making of modernity itself. Today, I will argue that there was in fact no such thing as an 18th century discovery of deep time, because the idea, the concept, had always circulated freely in medieval and early modern Europe and was always relatively uncontroversial. What the 18th century actually did, in my opinion, was to bury the memory of the richness and complexity of pre-modern Earth history. On its grave, it erected the historiographical myth of a Christian tradition that uniformly rejected the antiquity of the Earth, as opposed to a new secular science ready to embrace it. Largely unchallenged for more than 2 centuries, that account solidified over time into the still dominant truism. I understand that these claims may sound a bit radical, perhaps, to someone in the public, but I do believe that this is the only possible conclusion that one can draw from documentary evidence. Now, while my focus will be on the construction of this narrative in the course of the 1700s and on the political and cultural forces that drove its elaboration and consolidation, I need to show, first of all, why the notion of an Enlightenment discovery of deep time just does not hold water. It is well known, of course, that Aristotelian natural philosophy envisaged an eternal world without a beginning and without an end, and that there was a heated debate in medieval Europe, and to a lesser extent, even in the Renaissance, on eternalism. What has not been fully appreciated, in my view, is the social and cultural diffusion of notions of an eternal or very ancient Earth. As long as we deal with university professors or unorthodox freethinkers, we may continue to think that these were dangerous ideas relegated to intellectual elites, conversant with philosophical literature in Latin, or the usual precursors, a category that I hate personally, but without any real social and cultural depth. Now, the problem with this interpretation is the unquestionable evidence that such notions became available in didactic works in the vernacular since the very inception of the genre, that is, the late 1200s, since the very beginning of scientific literature in the vernacular. And even in the following centuries, there seems to have been no real opposition to the fusion of theories of an ancient Earth among a vernacular public made of artists, merchants, courtiers, even women. So the vernacular meteorology published by Fausto de Longiano in Venice in 1542, that you can see here, this is a page in the chapter that deals with the generation of mountains and hills, as you can read in the upper part of the page. And it is really a small booklet. It is cheap and dirty vernacularization, if you pass me this term. This was very typical. In this chapter, Fausto da Longiano, the author, mentioned at least 4 times the eternity of the world, or that an almost eternal length of time is needed in order to build great mountains. But what's the problem? There is more than enough time in order to do that. And he says so without any qualification, and obviously without any concern that these statements could be somehow troublesome. Now, this is 1942, and a few years later, this is not already plausible in this way, because the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the rise of biblical literalism, of course, were accompanied by a strong cultural pressure toward the construction of a mosaic natural philosophy. Yet the more secular traditions remain strong and lively and absolutely permissible within certain limits. At least in Catholic countries, the only real issue was with the eternity of the world rather than its antiquity. So that unlike in Longiano's time, already like 10 years later or 20 years later, authors had to qualify the term if they chose to use it. For example, saying, oh, the world is eternal according to Aristotle, but of course we know that it was in fact created, when was not an issue normally. For example, in, let's see if you can. Okay, so for example, in his 1616 work on fossil wood published in Rome itself, Fabio Colonna could state without any problem that the earth changed and the sea as well, and they took each other's place not only at the time of the universal flood, but even in other centuries and in other places. A few decades later, painter Agostino Scilla stated in his famous work on fossils that they must have been a creature that actually were alive a long time ago, which was absolutely not new. In this quotation that we see here, he basically mentions among the possible reasons of why we can find a fossil of marine creatures on dry land, the universal flood, the particular floods of the meteorological tradition, and the Aristotelian theory of geological change. That is, that the ocean slowly crawls above dry land, uncovering a country while it submerges another. So the reason why we have we can find fossils of marine creatures on dry land is simply that this used to be the bottom of the ocean. And in spite of this declaration of neutrality or ignorance in these lines, elsewhere in the book, instead it clearly says that the earth is old, that marine fossils could not have originated from one single great inundation. Actually, in this kind of literature, the Noetic flood was treated since centuries, since at least 1200, either as a miracle incomprehensible to human reason, and as such completely excluded from natural philosophy that can ignore it entirely, or the latest of the cyclical floods of the meteorological tradition, used by God in this case towards providential aids. This had always been perfectly normal and perfectly orthodox. The biblical flood until this time, after this time, was mainly a theological and a moral event, not necessarily linked to any scientific or material evidence, nor was it needed to explain the aspect and the natural productions of the Earth's surface. And there is a diffuse belief that the diluvial origin of marine fossil was the mainstream explanation, but it is not true. Actually, this theory never had much traction among natural philosophers, that in many cases demoted it as just a popular belief, a popular story. And they did so openly. This remained true until the rise of diluvialism in the late 1600s. Diluvialism, that is, the idea that a single global inundation in historical times could actually explain the origin of fossils and the geological appearance of the Earth, thus making its antiquity unnecessary. If so, natural history can and perhaps should be used to shore up the revelation through independent accounts of the history of the Earth that would confirm the literal truth of the biblical text. Diluvialism became rapidly popular across Europe, particularly in its British versions, such as John Woodward's 1695 essay towards a natural history of the Earth, and the Latin version that was published by Johann Jakob Scheuchzer in Switzerland in 1704. And here we see another of the typical works of Scheuchzer's, by Scheuchzer, The Herbal of the Flood, and the title doesn't need any explanation. However, to use natural history to prove the truth of Genesis meant to make it dangerously dependent on scientific evidence, and inevitably it began to stimulate powerful connections between diluvialism and religious orthodoxy. So by the early 1700s, the tendency to identify opposition to diluvialism with skepticism and unbelief was rising justified alarms. To Antonio Vallisneri, who taught medicine at Padua in the early 1700s and was certainly the preeminent Italian naturalist of the time, the flood must remain a miraculous event that escapes rational investigation, did not leave any traces of its passage on the surface of the Earth, and can be completely ignored by natural philosophy. It cannot be part of the physical history of the earth. And the possibility of this approach to him was a cornerstone not only of the philosophers' scientific freedom, but also of Italian and Catholic scientific traditions. And for what I have seen, he was perfectly right, to the point that in this book on the marine bodies found on mountains, he even had a chapter written by a theologian supporting his approach. That if you talk as a natural philosopher of the antiquity of the world and so on, that's perfectly acceptable, as long as you keep away from theology and theological implications. Now, Vallisneri, when he wrote these kind of things that you are reading here, he was not the peddler of astonishing novelties, as he is usually portrayed. He was the defender of a threatened tradition. Furthermore, many believers held that diluvialism was actually a threat to the faith itself, not only to natural philosophy. Take, for example, the German physician Johann Gottlob Kruger, that wrote in around the middle of the century that those who believe the fact of the biblical flood without asking for evidence will continue to believe, and those who were disposed to doubt it will remain in the same disposition and even confirmed into it, seeing how our arguments are not strong enough to convince them. In other words, lack of conclusive physical evidence for the flood, and many thought that there was no such conclusive evidence, could turn diluvialism into a millstone around the neck of Christianity. By charging moderate opponents like Vallisneri with irreligion and materialism, many diluvialists offered to more radical foes the opportunity to turn their arguments against them. That is, Christianity and a young earth would not indeed be separated. The falsity of the latter would entail the absurdity of the former. In the early 1700s, this was a low-hanging fruit that many philosophers were quick to grab. The operation, however, required a further element, namely a history of time that was compatible with the philosophes' representation of Christianity as a force against reason and humankind's progress. In the course of the century, this operation involved immensely popular authors such as Voltaire, Boulanger, D'Holbach, and others. And in spite of their considerable differences, they all intended to relegate Noah's flood not to a different sphere of truth, like Vallisneri and the tradition that he supported, but to superstition, myth, or even to an actual event that took indeed place and that the Bible relates as a human document of the first stages of the current civilization. Among those authors, Boulanger and D'Holbach were especially influential in the elaboration of this narrative. Boulanger placed an exterminating deluge at the very origin of the current civilization and of knowable human history. For the same reason, Aristotle, Plato, and the whole of the meteorological tradition had done the same. How to explain otherwise the recent appearance of arts, sciences, and human documents if the earth and humankind itself were immensely more ancient? Unlike the diluvialists, however, Boulanger divested the flood of any providential meaning. The global inundation, perpetuated by the myth of the Bible and also many other nations, was only the latest occurrence of an entirely natural catastrophe that periodically wipes out human civilization. Is this a new theory? Not at all. It was his version of stuff that had been circulating since the antiquity, and absolutely medieval and early modern Europe. What was new was that Boulanger used Earth history to undermine the real character of the Genesis. And in my opinion, what is even more consequential, to undermine the legitimacy of the political institutions of ancien regime societies. According to Boulanger, religion itself rose from the traumatic experience of the near extinction of humankind, as scattered and shocked survivors tried to make sense in supernatural terms of the inconceivable catastrophe that befell them. And this description that you're reading by Boulanger of these survivors of the flood, it is very similar to a description of the survivors of the latest renovation of the world that you can find in the Venetian philosopher Francesco Patrizi's Dialogues on Rhetoric, published in 1562. Not long after the flood, according to Boulanger, monarchs began to pose as images of the dreaded God or God themselves, subjugating the other man. And so every government, down to Boulanger's times, had been but a form of theocracy, enabled by the religious sentiment issued from an incomprehensible natural disaster. And by making humans morally and psychologically responsible for the flawed political organisms that oppressed them, the church perpetuated their subjugation. There is the reason why the entry Deluge in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie. One moment. Okay. Sorry. This is the reason why the entry Deluge in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie mounts a defense of the reality and universality of the biblical flood that may surprise modern readers. But in fact, this entry was written by Diderot, summarizing basically things that he found in Boulanger's manuscript. So this was Boulanger's flood, not the flood of the Catholic tradition. Most of the articles in the encyclopedia dealing with geology, mineralogy of Earth history were actually written by D'Holbach, who was profoundly influenced by Boulanger's thesis on the intimate connection between the Earth history, the history of the Earth, and the natural origin of religion and despotism. During the 1750s, decades of elaboration converged into a vision of the history of deep time that not only suited D'Holbach's political and ideological agendas, but proved appealing to a vast and diversified public. In this scenario that is laid out in the entry fossils in the encyclopedia, the ancients, who were still uncorrupted or retained the memory of the scientific notions of the pre-diluvial world, unanimously regarded the Earth as immensely old, if not eternal. Their correct insights, however, were later suppressed by the Mosaic theocracy that imposed the idea of a recent creation, to the point that alternatives became inconceivable. Only in the course of the previous century did some philosophers begin to shake the chains imposed upon their minds. And guided by observation and reason, they rapidly rediscovered the evident truth of the great antiquity of the Earth, long buried under the weight of theological oppression. D'Holbach expanded on this conception in his 1770 System of Nature, but its essential elements, as I said, appeared already in the entry fossils of the encyclopedia that was published in 1757. To my knowledge, and I may be wrong, there may be some previous literature that I haven't found, this is the first clear enunciation of the core of what remains the mainstream narrative in the history of deep time. And why D'Holbach presented it as a matter of fact, this was actually a very recent elaboration. Take, for example, how D'Holbach portrays physician and philosopher Girolamo Fracastoro, who in the early 1500s famously recognized the marine fossils as sea creatures that had been alive. Fracastoro argued that we find them on dry land because in the distant past, this used to be the seafloor, and it will be again in the future. This was standard Aristotelian meteorology, nothing particularly new at the time. It was mainstream, actually. Yet D'Holbach managed to turn Fracastoro into the delusionist, alleging that biblical literalism dominated his and his contemporaries' minds to the point that even when they could recognize fossils for the remains of actual creatures, they could not conceive any explanation but the universal flood of the Bible, in spite of the fact that Fracastoro himself explicitly ruled out a universal flood as a possible cause for the origin of marine fossils. But the complex and sophisticated pluralism of the previous centuries could not exist in a dark age supposedly dominated by religious intolerance, superstition, and the blind acceptance of the letter of the Bible. So while these philosophers did not create the equation between Christianity and a young creation, they did erase centuries of history by presenting it as the only imaginable and permissible belief in Europe until their time. Of course, it would be simplistic to imagine them as a cabal engaged in willful deceit. I think that things were a bit more nuanced. Historical writing at the time was still conceived as in terms of picking examples from the past to teach moral and civic lessons, rather than as critical analysis of all the available sources. And so these philosophers rearranged and reinterpreted historical material available to them, known to them, in a way that made sense to their own sense of history and to what they did maintain was true. They were fighting the good fight. And so if they found some inconsistencies, they could be glossed over. To all appearances, they did so not more because of their inability to actually grasp Renaissance history and its meaning than for deliberate distortion. As a matter of fact, by then, many of their conservative foes were neither better informed nor less eager to rewrite the past in much the same way. Indeed, I think that those philosophers may not have been so successful had their opponents not adopted a similar framework. The decade that saw the publication of the first tomes of the Encyclopédie witnessed the rise of a forceful and vocal movement that denounced with increasing anxiety and at a certain point apocalyptic terms the diffusion of materialism and irreligion. Initially, the so-called anti-philosophers were mainly enlightened Catholics or Protestants who opposed the alleged anti-Christian drift of contemporary scientific and philosophical literature. But soon enough, emphasis within the movement shifted to the worrisome political implications of the new philosophy. It was self-evident to many conservatives that the altar would not be touched without shaking the throne, and that to attack the first was to undermine the second and try to replace a divinely ordained society with the arbitrary faculty of establishing and dissolving governments at will. Anyone who is familiar here with Enlightenment political thought will not find anything weird in what I'm saying. But the thing that maybe has not been understood so far is that once weaponized into a tool of anti-Christian and political propaganda, the antiquity of the earth came to be perceived in conservative milieux as a direct threat to the basis of the existing social order. That was a big deal. And many of them actually bolstered the appeal and legitimacy of their positions by doubling down, paradoxically, on the philosophers' narrative. That is, a young earth had always been, indeed, an unquestioned tenet of Christianity, only recently attacked by modern skeptics for purely ideological reasons. True geology will demonstrate the historical accuracy of the revelation by showing the reality of a universal inundation in historical times. As the Venetian conservative pointed out, when the flood is not only a point of faith, but a physical fact, the unbeliever remains without a shelter. If Moses is fruitful in such a resounding event, then the amount of events he narrates are equally true. Conversely, if Moses could not even get a universal inundation of the whole of the earth right, how can one believe him in anything else? 18th century Venice provides indeed an especially compelling case of how the conservative reaction contributed to the establishment of the new narrative of deep time, or the history of deep time. In the second half of the century, the ruling elites of the Venetian state began to espouse diluvialism and the young creation as instruments of social and political preservation, often taking part directly in the debate on the history of the earth and using their social clout, their soft power, if you want, to impose a diluvialist orthodoxy where none had existed before. So fossils, rocks, natural specimens, you can follow that even from the point of view of material history. All of these specimens began to transit from the museums of physicians, country priests, pharmacists into aristocratic collections, where they were put into the service of a politically conservative science, which strove to demonstrate the reality of a recent inundation of the globe. In the imaginary past that they were creating, no one used to doubt that the fossil fish buried in the earth demonstrated the truth of Genesis and the reality of a deluge that a few thousand years earlier punished humankind's rebellion against authority. Caught between the philosophers' hammer and the conservatives' envy, the complex and nuanced pre-modern history of deep time was thus replaced with the simplistic dichotomy that still informs our culture and our society at large. As far as I can judge, by the late 1700s, that narrative was already firmly established. And so in the early 1830s, the great geologist Charles Lyell would write in perfect faith in his immensely influential Principles of Geology that it had been the consistent belief of the Christian world that the origin of this planet was not more remote than a few thousand years, and that since the creation, the deluge was the only catastrophe by which considerable change had been wrought on the Earth's surface. I hope I have presented a convincing, or at least an intriguing case that this story might have been more complicated. But in case you're not convinced yet, and would like to see more, as Fabrizio anticipated, On the Edge of Eternity, the Antiquity of the Earth in Medieval and Early Modern Europe will be available with Oxford University Press by late summer. This may not be the final cover. I'm still quarreling with the production over that. Thank you for your attention.